Good day, everyone, and welcome to the Pathway to 17 Summit. My name is Sephutile Mhlongo. I'm currently the Manager of Financial Regulation and Supervision with Digital Frontiers, and I will be the moderator for this session. This session is titled The Data Economy, Governance, and Cross-Border Data Flows. I am joined by Susan Aaronson, who is a research professor and Director of Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub. Thank you for joining us, Susan. I will now hand over to you to introduce yourself as well as take us through your presentation.
So this is a paper that I presented on trust and trade, and an earlier iteration of it has been published by CG, and now it's going to, an updated version of it is going to be published by Oxford. And basically the idea is that, in general, trade, you can't have trade, especially online trade, right? Which is what the digital economy is about, without trust. But unfortunately, it's very difficult to trust people you don't know. It's very difficult to trust online communications. So what do you do about that? That's the first thing. The second thing is we in particular need to have trust in the digital economy because, again, the digital economy is full of people who don't know each other, will never meet. And so how can they make that leap of faith? And so my argument is essentially that we need to find ways to include in that economy the views of people, average citizens who are engaged in that trade, who are not normally consulted in the making of trade policy. So how do you get them into that discussion, right? That's not so easy to do. So, okay. So I hope everyone can see my slide now, but so the first thing is to look at the things that people are concerned about. So here's some polling data that shows that people are really frightened online, that they're worried about a mix of threats. And those threats include disinformation, fraud, harassment. Okay, and we have a shared failure. We have not made cybersecurity, disinformation. These are not trade priorities, although there have been some discussions at the WTO about these issues. But if you were to look at trade agreements, which is what we're going to look at the next slide, these issues are not really included. And so the question someone might ask is, are they digital trade issues? Well, let's think about that, right? Non-personal data should flow across borders without restrictions. But obviously, there are times when you must put in some restrictions in place to build trust. So I'm saying things like spam, malware, disinformation flow across borders and they undermine trust. Now, trade agreements do discuss spam, and they say signatories of digital trade agreements should endeavor to cooperate. But, they should try to cooperate is not enough to encourage such cooperation. Moreover, there's another problem, which is that many nations lack the will, the capacity, or the funding to endeavor to cooperate because they don't have laws or they don't have the funding to enforce their laws, right? Especially in a time of a global pandemic when many countries are focused on providing healthcare to their people, or at a time when, oil prices are so high, they have to help subsidize food costs and energy costs. So I'm saying that the US and WTO templates are out of date. Because the template says, basically, we should have the free flow of data across borders with exceptions, right, for national needs, to protect national security, to protect public morals, to protect privacy. Secondly, there's a ban on data localization. And what that means is a government can't require another government to say data must be stored in local servers. Also, there's a ban on performance requirements, which say Facebook or WeChat, you must disclose your algorithms. Okay, and finally, as I said before, they say enforce your own laws. But what if a country doesn't have those laws yet? Moreover, trade agreements don't address the concerns of users, which, as I showed before through polling data, users are concerned about things like disinformation, like malware, like internet shutdowns, which happen in India so frequently, 49 times last year, which means that your economy can't function if you're shutting down the internet, especially a high-tech country like India. So how do you get cooperation? Okay, so this is a table of what trade agreements say already. And I hope you'll get a chance to dig into this a bit more. Okay, so now I'm going to go into examples of how these things I'm talking about, like an internet shutdown, acts like a barrier to trade. So the first is, these are statistics from 2020, so they're not the most recent statistics, but 40% of these shutdowns were associated with human rights abuse, restrictions on freedom of assembly. So that's the human rights impact. They have economic impacts, and this is why they should be in trade agreements, such as reduced productivity, higher operating costs, right? A day without the internet means a day without business for many companies, small and large. And these ill effects are exported globally. When India, a huge country, deeply involved in digital trade and digital issues, 2 billion-ish people, these effects are exported globally because the internet is a shared resort. Yet no trade agreement discusses this. Okay, disinformation. Is disinformation a trade barrier? In fact, it's no different from spam. Now, it can often be a domestic problem, but it is facilitated by bots and algorithms, right? This is, disinformation is not something new, global disinformation. We saw a lot of that in World War II, as example, but it has a real economic price. It's an economic problem because it can affect the reputations of firms and stock prices. It can undermine public health and belief in science, and it can reduce trust. So I'm saying it is also a trade barrier. So I'm just giving these two examples out of the ones that to save time, but to give you a sense. So if we wanted to address this in a trade agreement, if we really want to build trust, I am saying that we need to focus on the things, not just that business finds a barrier, but it's a barrier to public involvement online. So I'm saying we should focus on interoperability regimes for personal data and consumer welfare. So nations need to work together on these issues. We need to explore, am I right? Are internet shutdowns and censorship a trade barrier? The United States government has investigated this and has released 2 reports on it. This discussion is not new. Google cited China's Great Firewall as a trade barrier in the early 2000s, but the US declined to make it a trade dispute. So I do think the WTO needs to talk about this. And there is some evidence at trade policy reviews that nations are starting to bring this up as a trade barrier. So we'll see. I think we need to come up. So the UNITRAL is a UN agency that creates a template of laws so that developing countries that may not have these kind of laws can build upon it. It serves as a guide to them to make their own laws. And so I do think UNITRAL needs to get involved in this, specifically for shared privacy laws and shared consumer welfare laws. And then here's the most important thing, which is governments such as the US and Switzerland and Germany are starting to provide training and incentives to developing countries to understand data is not just a commercial asset, but it also is a public good, right? Information is a public good. For example, DNA evidence. And if you understand that data can simultaneously be a commercial asset and a public good, you need to govern it very carefully. And so all nations are wrestling with this right now. You see this in the EU efforts to both regulate AI and the data that underpins AI. And you see it in their proposals, such as this one I have right in front of me by the French government for a European initiative for a digital common, a shared platform where data, all types of data would be shared in recognition that it can be this dual thing, a commercial asset and simultaneously a public good. How do you share it then? So that's the big question. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan. I think we have a bit of time. There was the slide on the table. Would you like to expand on that one?
Okay, I will. I'll share it with you again. And this, here it is. Well, this is what recent trade agreements say. Some recent trade agreements say about these issues. And the point that I'm trying to get at is, many of these don't talk about trust. And they have, in my mind, a limited understanding of what kind of rules build trust in trade agreements. And I think we in the United States, it's interesting that some of the most innovative economies really aren't thinking long and hard as they should about what trade agreements should include so that they can build trust. But I do fear, and I'll give an example and I'll criticize my own government, Sephutile. The United States recently said, we've agreed to negotiate a trade agreement. This is the first Biden administration trade agreement beyond the WTO that they're negotiating, but we're going to keep everything secret. And that's how trade agreements have proceeded, for hundreds of years. But I'm not sure that's going to work in the digital economy. And so I'm working on an op-ed with my editor. It makes me want to scream. Just as the digital economy has disrupted everything from, how we travel to how we find a date or a friend, or how we monitor our training for the Ironman triathlon, it's going to change trade negotiations. And yet the US, Australia, New Zealand, etc., all these countries are saying, we're going to negotiate it in the exact same way. That ain't going to work in my view. And it's going to lead to lots of opposition.
Thank you. I like what you said there about the digital economy is going to change the way we do trade. I must admit, this is not a topic that I have thought extensively about, but I have enjoyed the presentation. And if I have any more questions, I'll come back to them. But I do have two questions that I'd like to ask you. So the first one is, from your experience, how far do we still need to go with increasing data literacy in leadership? Is data literacy
It's ridiculous how far we need to go. And, some governments, I think, are doing a fabulous job. But I mean, there isn't, let me give you an example from the corporate side. So you asked about government officials. So many big firms now have chief data officers, but those chief data officers have very little understanding of the data that they actually have. So that's on the corporate side, let alone on the government side. Using my own country as an example, the US government the US government has long been transparent about the data that it holds and sharing it. So as example, anything the US government funds, so a research project, if I had a research project that looked at labor rights around the world, and the US government funded my research through NSF or the State Department or whatever, every data point of my scholarship has to be publicly available in a machine readable format so anybody could use it, in the recognition that data should be shared, right? However, the US government doesn't share a lot of data among agencies. So it's just starting, right? So I have a criticism of the firms in that the firms, even though they're starting to have chief data officers, recognizing that data is a commercial asset, they don't understand that it can also be a public good asset. What do I mean by that? You've probably seen Google Analytics, which shows how many people are searching for respirators. And if you look at that, if lots of people are looking for respirators next week, let's say, that might lead you to some insights that lots of people have colds or the flu, right? So that kind of thing. That is Google's data, but it has public good implications. And Uber is another example, right? Uber collects data on traffic time. So how long does it take to get from the local airport back to your house? And Uber can compare that data at 10 a.m. and at 5 a.m. That might be really helpful to the city of Toronto or the city of Johannesburg, in that the city of Johannesburg might want to know, gee, if we have pricing of certain lanes, maybe we price it a little bit higher during high traffic times. So we both make more money and we discourage people from traveling at that time. So that kind of thing. And so there isn't really a good dialogue yet or understanding in all sectors about this. And I hope to do something to remedy that and get people thinking about that dualistic nature of data. And that's our next research project at the Hub.
That sounds very, very exciting. As a research topic, and I know I will be following tabs with you to learn more about it. So I'll move on to my second question, which is, in your opinion, what are the risks and opportunities of cross-border data flows, and how can these flows be balanced with data privacy, which is one of the lowest?
That's a problem at all. I think that's a made-up problem, which is that all trade agreements say that nations can restrict cross-border data flows to protect privacy. Please note, I really don't want to ever use the word privacy, because personal data protection can protect lots of human rights. One human right is the right to privacy, but the right to privacy implicates or affects lots of other equally important human rights, such as freedom of association or freedom of speech. If you don't feel that your data is protected, you may be more, people in Ukraine or in Belarus right now might be more uncomfortable putting their opinions forward, right, in a time of war, and when they could be harassed by, the country that they're at war with. I misspoke. And so these issues, so forgive me for kind of being pushy here, but we're really not just talking about protecting privacy. We're talking about a whole bunch of human rights. And that's why I don't talk about it as privacy. Unfortunately, that is how the debate began in the EU. And so many people talk about it in terms of privacy laws. In terms of trade, since that is already protected by the exceptions, it's not an issue. The issue is cloud storage and sovereignty over data, right? And so in our analysis, in our mapping of how countries address data, almost every country feels like personal data should be stored domestically because they can't trust international companies on that data. But there is this technical fix now that the Europeans are putting forward, which is called international data spaces. And what that means is it's sort of a application that basically says that the cloud, the data will be stored in a particular type of server, which is located in a country, but the data can travel across borders. And the truth is, every day, every minute, our personal data travels across borders because you are living in South Africa, but your best friend might live in the UK or France or Swaziland. And so your data, you know, whenever they look at you on Facebook or on WeChat or whatever apps you use, that data is traveling cross-border. To me, the funny question is, should it be governed by trade agreements? And I am deeply ambivalent about that, because that data is not traded, it is exchanged, but there's no commercial transaction. One thing that I think is interesting is financial data, your beat, and that I think there's a lot more experimentation with financial data moving across borders, and including regulatory sandboxes. So there's been a lot more trust and innovation in that area, and I'm not sure why. But that's something for another scholar with expertise in financial data to explore. So.
Yeah. I think that's all the time we have for. Yeah, do you have any concluding remarks before we close off for the session?
I just encourage people to get beyond the rhetoric and really think about, you know, I'm signaling deep ambivalence with trade agreements as a tool to govern data. But I think we are at a point, and the reason I say that is just because, as I said, it's not really traded. Some of it is traded. There is a financial transaction, but most of it is probably not. And so we need to think about where we can govern this in a way that facilitates dialogue, facilitates capacity building, because so much of the data comes from citizens in the developing world and middle income world, not the US's or Switzerland's or Australia's of the world. So we need to figure that out. But the other thing that I want to leave people with is that data is not a resource like oil. It is not depletable. It can be reused 1 billion times, 27 billion times. And it is a public good as well as a commercial asset. So we have to govern it very carefully. And we're just learning how to do it, and no one knows how to do it right. But please check out our website where we map the governance of data for 68 countries and the EU, where you can learn what countries are doing at the national and international level. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us and participating.
Thank you for having me. I wish you the best.
See you. Thank you. Goodbye. Bye.